Life was comfortable. Zoe and I had built a life together that, from the outside, probably seemed perfect. We were one of those couples that people pointed at and said, they've got it figured out. We had a nice home in the suburbs, a two-story place with big bay windows that Zoe adored, surrounded by a garden that was my pride and joy. It was the kind of life I'd always wanted, steady, reliable, and full of those small, simple pleasures that made you feel like you were on the right track. I met Zoe almost 6 years ago, back when life was a little less complicated. We were both 23, fresh out of college, and eager to take on the world. I was just starting my career as a commercial pilot, a job that gave me a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced before. I loved being in the sky, looking down at the world from above, watching cities and landscapes shrink into tiny dots as I soared through the clouds. Zoe, on the other hand, was finding her footing in the world of advertising. She had a sharp mind, quick wit, and a smile that could light up any room. That's what drew me to her initially. That spark, that energy she carried with her everywhere she went. She wasn't just beautiful. She had this contagious passion for life that made everything feel more alive when she was around. We clicked almost immediately. Our first date was at this little Italian restaurant downtown, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and candlelit booths. I remember how she looked that night, wearing this deep green dress that hugged her body in all the right places, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders like something out of a movie. We spent hours talking about everything, our dreams, our goals, our fears, and by the time dessert rolled around, I knew I was hooked. Zoe had that effect on people. She could make you feel like you were the only person in the world when she talked to you. It was intoxicating. Fast forward 3 years, and we were standing at the altar, promising to spend the rest of our lives together. It was a beautiful day, sunny, but not too hot, with a gentle breeze that made Zoe's veil dance as she walked down the aisle. I remember how my heart raced when I saw her. God, she was stunning. I felt like the luckiest man in the world. The wedding was everything we'd wanted, a small ceremony with our closest friends and family, followed by a reception that lasted late into the night. We danced, we laughed, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The first couple of years were bliss. Zoe was just as passionate and driven as I remembered, throwing herself into her work and climbing the ladder at the advertising firm she'd joined after college. She was good at what she did, really good. She had a way of reading people, understanding what they wanted even when they couldn't articulate it themselves. It wasn't long before she was managing accounts for some pretty big clients. I was proud of her. Hell, I admired her. I always told her she was destined for great things, and it felt like I was watching her fulfill that destiny right before my eyes. My own career was going well, too. Being a pilot wasn't just a job for me, it was a calling. There was something about being up in the air, disconnected from everything on the ground, that gave me a sense of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. Sure, the long hours and frequent travel meant I was away from home more often than I'd like, but Zoe understood. She knew how much flying meant to me, and she never complained about the time I spent away. If anything, I think she enjoyed the independence it gave her. She had her own life, her own circle of friends, and I never wanted to be the kind of husband who smothered his wife or tried to control her. We trusted each other. At least, I thought we did. But somewhere along the way, things started to shift. It wasn't obvious at first, just small things, little moments that didn't seem like much on their own but added up over time. Zoe started coming home later than usual, always with a perfectly reasonable excuse. "We had a client dinner," she'd say, or, "I had to stay late for a meeting." I didn't think much of it at first. Her job was demanding, and late nights were part of the deal. Besides, I was no stranger to long hours myself. But then there were the mornings when she'd spend a little extra time getting ready for work, putting more effort into her appearance than I'd seen in a while. I chalked it up to her wanting to look professional. After all, she was now managing some big accounts. But still, something about it gnawed at me. Then there were the phone calls, She'd step out of the room to take certain calls, her voice dropping to a hushed whisper. When I asked who it was, she'd say it was work-related, nothing to worry about. And maybe it wasn't. I mean, she was handling sensitive client information, so it made sense that some conversations needed to be private. But it still felt off. I tried not to let it bother me. Zoe had never given me any real reason to doubt her, and I didn't want to start now. But it was hard to ignore the feeling that something had changed between us. Our conversations became more surface level, like we were just going through the motions. The deep, intimate talks we used to have, the ones that made me fall in love with her, had become rare. It was like we were both in our own worlds, orbiting around each other but never really connecting. Our SX life, which had once been full of passion, had also slowed down. At first, I didn't think much of it. Every couple goes through dry spells, but the longer it went on, the more it felt like we were drifting apart. I tried to bring it up a few times, casually, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. But Zoe always had an excuse. She was tired or stressed or just not in the mood. And I understood. I really did. Life was busy, and work could be draining. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else going on, something she wasn't telling me. Despite the growing distance between us, I held on to the hope that we could get back to the way things were. That's why I decided to plan something special, a night just for us. No work, no distractions, just me and Zoe, like it used to be. I went all out, wanting to show her that I still cared, that I still loved her more than anything. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, even putting fresh sheets on the bed. I picked up ribeye steaks from Gus, splurged on a bottle of wine that was way out of my usual price range, and bought a dozen roses from the florist down the street, the kind Zoe loved, deep red with petals so soft they felt like velvet. As I prepared dinner, slicing potatoes for the scallop dish she adored, I felt a sense of optimism creeping in. Maybe this was all we needed, a night to reconnect, to remember why we fell in love in the first place. I imagined us sitting at the table, laughing over a glass of wine, the candles casting a soft glow over her face, as she smiled at me the way she used to. I could almost feel her hands in mine, hear her voice telling me she loved me. I let myself believe that tonight would be the night we'd find our way back to each other. By the time everything was ready, the steaks seasoned, the potatoes in the oven, the candles lit, I was feeling good, hopeful. I glanced at the clock. Zoe should have been home by now, but she was running late. I told myself it was fine. Maybe she got caught up at work, or maybe traffic was bad. I poured myself a glass of wine and waited, trying not to let the creeping doubt take hold. 9 o'clock came and went, then 10. I sent her a text, a casual, "Hey, you okay? Dinner's ready." But there was no response. The wine, which had once tasted smooth and rich, now felt bitter on my tongue. The candles burned down to their stubs, casting long shadows across the room. The perfect evening I'd envisioned was slowly crumbling, and with each passing minute, the sinking feeling in my gut grew stronger. By the time I heard Zoe's car pull into the driveway, it was well past 10. The night that I had spent hours preparing for, the evening that I had pinned all my hopes on, had already unraveled. The wine tasted like acid in my mouth, and the candles were nothing more than waxy puddles on the table. I stood in the kitchen, staring blankly at the clock, trying to push away the creeping bitterness that had settled in my chest. But when the door finally opened, it wasn't just Zoe who walked in. She wasn't alone. A man followed her into the house, casually walking through the front door as if he belonged there. He was tall, maybe 6 feet 1 inch, with broad shoulders, blonde hair that looked meticulously styled, and this easy, confident smile that rubbed me the wrong way immediately. He had that polished corporate look, sharp suit, expensive shoes, the kind of guy who never seemed to sweat, even in a crisis. My heart dropped. I had never seen him before, but something about the way he moved, the way Zoe didn't flinch when he followed her inside, told me more than I wanted to know. "Richard," Zoe called out, almost like an afterthought. "You're still up?" Still up? I had been waiting for her for hours, meticulously planning a night for the two of us, and she walks in like it's any other evening, like she hadn't just left me hanging while she was God knows where with this guy. I didn't respond immediately, my mind trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before me. The man, her colleague, I assumed, grinned at me and extended his hand. "Hey there, Richard. Gerald. I work with Zoe." His voice was smooth, almost too smooth, like he'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. There was an arrogance in his tone, a smugness that made my skin crawl. I shook his hand reluctantly, trying to mask the confusion and anger bubbling up inside me. His grip was firm, overly so, like he was trying to make some kind of point. I glanced at Zoe, searching her face for an explanation, something that would make this all make sense. But she was avoiding eye contact, her expression tight, like she knew what was coming and wasn't ready to face it. My chest tightened. This wasn't normal. Something was off. Something big. "Zoe," I began, forcing the words out slowly. "What's going on? Why is Gerald here?" Zoe bit her lip, hesitating for a moment before finally speaking. "Richard, we need to talk. Gerald and I have something we need to tell you." The way she said it, the careful, deliberate tone, made my stomach twist. I felt the ground shift beneath me, the weight of the impending conversation pressing down on my shoulders. My mind raced, jumping to conclusions I didn't want to face. Was this it? Had I been right all along? Was this the moment she'd finally tell me she'd been seeing someone else behind my back? I tried to steady my voice, to keep calm despite the storm of emotions brewing inside me. "What the hell is going on?" Gerald stepped forward, his grin never faltering. "Richard, relax, man. This is just, well, it's going to be a bit of a shock, but we think it's for the best." "We." He said it so casually, like they had already made a decision about my life without me, like they were in control. I stared at him, trying to hold on to the last shreds of reason. "What are you talking about?" Zoe finally spoke, her voice shaky but determined. "Gerald and I have been talking, Richard. And, well, I've decided that I need to explore some things, about myself, about us." My heart was pounding now, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I had no idea where this conversation was headed, but I knew it wasn't good. "What the hell does that mean, Zoe?" She hesitated, glancing at Gerald for support before continuing. "I'm going to spend the weekend with Gerald." It felt like someone had punched me in the gut. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're... what?" Gerald took a step closer, his voice maddeningly calm. "It's not what you think, Richard. She's not leaving you. She just needs an experience, a chance to learn some things that she's been missing." I couldn't even process what he was saying. This wasn't just some client dinner or late-night work meeting. This was my wife, telling me she was going to spend a weekend with another man. I stared at Zoe, waiting for her to take it back, waiting for her to tell me this was all a joke, that I'd misunderstood. But she didn't. "It's just for one weekend," Zoe said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Just to see what it's like, to understand what I need. After that, things can go back to normal." Normal? Was she out of her mind? She thought she could walk into our home with this man, tell me she was spending the weekend with him, and then just come back to me like nothing had happened? The anger that had been simmering in the back of my mind now flared into a full-blown fire. "And what exactly are you going to be doing with him for this weekend?" I demanded, my voice sharp, filled with disbelief. Gerald chuckled, as if the question was absurd. "Richard, you've got nothing to worry about. Zoe just wants to experience a little adventure, let's call it. She's going to learn a few things. Actually." I felt like the world had spun out of control, like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. Did this asshole really just walk into my home and tell me he was going to teach my wife how to fuck? You're out of your goddamn mind, I spat, my fists clenched at my sides. I could feel the rage boiling over, every muscle in my body screaming for me to throw this smug bastard out of my house. But Gerald wasn't fazed. He just smiled that same cocky smile, his tone as casual as if he were discussing weekend plans with a buddy. Look, I know this sounds insane, but trust me, man. It'll be good for your marriage. Zoe will come back to you with a whole new perspective. You'll both be better off for it. I turned to Zoe, desperately searching her face for some sign that she wasn't completely lost to me. Zoe, is this what you want? To run off with him for a weekend like this? She swallowed hard, her eyes flicking between me and Gerald, guilt and something else, something darker, flickering across her face. It's not about running off, Richard. It's just, I need this. I need to understand what I'm missing. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman I loved, the woman I had built a life with, was standing in front of me, telling me she needed to fuck another man to figure out her life. And this man, this Gerald, was standing there like some kind of mentor, offering her a weekend of enlightenment. Gerald shrugged, walking over to Zoe's side, placing a possessive hand on her lower back. It's just one weekend. She'll be back before you know it, and trust me, everything will go back to normal. She'll be yours, body and soul. I couldn't take it anymore. The room was spinning, my vision narrowing as the anger, disbelief, and betrayal swallowed me whole. No, I said, my voice hardening, the weight of the words sinking into the room. This isn't happening. If you walk out that door with him, don't expect to come back. Zoe's face crumpled, torn between the two worlds she was balancing on the edge of. Gerald's smile faltered slightly, sensing the shift in my tone. But I didn't care. I wasn't going to stand here and be the passive husband while my wife skipped off to some weekend fantasy with this smug bastard. You walk out that door, Zoe, I repeated, my voice dangerously low, and you don't come back. The silence after my ultimatum hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating like smoke in a room with no windows. Zoe's face twisted with guilt, but there was a stubbornness there too, a resolve that cut deeper than anything else. It was Gerald who broke the tension first, his arrogant grin shifting into something darker, something colder. He stepped closer to me, his presence radiating dominance, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Richard, let's not make this harder than it has to be, he said, his voice soft but laced with menace. You think you can stop this? You can't. The casualness in his words felt like a slap to the face. He was talking about my wife as if she were some piece of property he could borrow for the weekend, like this was a done deal and I was just expected to roll over and accept it. I couldn't believe this was happening, but the way he looked at me, like I was already defeated, only fueled the fire inside me. I'm not letting you take her, I growled, my fists clenching at my sides. Gerald's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with something almost predatory. Oh, but you will, Richard. Because if you don't, I can promise you, your life is going to get a lot more difficult. He took another step forward, his face inches from mine now, and I could feel the weight of his words bearing down on me like a physical force. I've done this before, he continued, his voice low and dripping with condescension. You're not the first husband who couldn't satisfy his wife, and you won't be the last. Zoe's been telling me everything, Richard, how things have been lacking between you two. He chuckled, glancing over at Zoe, who stood behind him, her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to protect herself from the truth of what was happening. Zoe, my wife. The woman I had devoted the last 6 years of my life to was standing there, letting this bastard talk about our marriage, our most private moments, like they were his to judge. I felt sick, the bile rising in my throat as I looked at her, hoping, praying, that she would speak up, that she would stop this madness. But she didn't. Instead, Zoe stepped forward, her voice shaking but steady enough to drive the knife deeper. "Richard, it's only once," she said softly, like she was offering some kind of mercy. "It's just for one weekend. I need this." My heart, already shattered by Gerald's smug threats, splintered further. "Need this?" I repeated, my voice cracking. "You need him?" Zoe's eyes welled up with tears, and for a brief second, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with, the woman I thought I knew. But that second passed, and the cold, hard reality hit me again. She wasn't going to change her mind. She had already made her choice, and it wasn't me. Gerald laughed, clearly enjoying the power he held in the room. "She'll come back to you, Richard," he said, like he was offering me some kind of consolation prize. "But after this, she'll know what she's missing, what you haven't been able to give her. And trust me, she'll be a lot more appreciative of you." I couldn't breathe. It was like I was drowning in my own living room, my own home, while this man, this stranger, stood here and dismantled everything I thought I had. And Zoe, my Zoe, was just letting it happen. I couldn't take it anymore. "Get the fuck out of my house!" I spat, my voice shaking with barely contained fury. But Gerald didn't move. He simply tilted his head, a mocking smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said, almost pitying me. "This isn't about you anymore. Zoe's already made up her mind. She's coming with me, and there's nothing you can do about it." Zoe stepped forward again, this time placing a hand on Gerald's arm like she was trying to calm him down. "Gerald, please," she murmured, then turned to me, her eyes pleading. "Richard, this will help. It'll fix things between us." I stared at her, my vision blurring with rage and humiliation. "Fix things?" I echoed. "You think fucking him for a weekend is going to fix us?" Zoe winced at the harshness of my words, but she didn't back down. "It's not just about SX, Richard. I need to feel something again. I need to know what I'm missing." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with, was standing in front of me, telling me that the only way to save our marriage was for her to sleep with another man. It was surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Gerald, sensing the shift in the conversation, leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper. "If you try to stop this, Richard, I'll ruin you," he said, his words cold and sharp. "I have connections. You don't know who you're dealing with. You could lose everything, your job, your house, your reputation. All it takes is one phone call." I felt the blood drain from my face. He wasn't bluffing. I could see it in his eyes, the calm, calculated confidence of a man who had done this before and come out on top. He had power, and he wasn't afraid to use it. Zoe reached out to me, her voice soft and full of guilt. "It's only once, Richard," she whispered. "Just one weekend. Then we can move on. Please, understand." Understand? How could I possibly understand this? My wife, the woman I had trusted with everything, was asking me to step aside while she spent the weekend with another man, and I was supposed to be okay with it? I was supposed to just accept it? For a moment, I considered walking away. I considered letting them go, letting Zoe make her mistake and deal with the consequences later. But then I looked at Gerald, standing there with that smug, arrogant grin, and something inside me snapped. I couldn't let him win. I couldn't let him take my wife and walk all over me like I was nothing. I took a deep breath, forcing the rage down, burying it under a layer of cold, calculated control. I would not lose my composure. Not yet. "If you think I'm going to let you walk out of here with her," I said slowly, my voice steady now, "you're dead wrong." Gerald raised an eyebrow, amused. "And what exactly are you going to do, Richard? Fight me? Call the cops? What's your plan?" I stepped forward, standing toe-to-toe with him, my face inches from his. "I don't need to fight you," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "I just need to show her what kind of man you really are." For the first time, Gerald's smile faltered, just a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He wasn't expecting me to stand up to him. He thought I'd crumble, that I'd cave under the weight of his threats. But I wasn't going to play by his rules. I turned to Zoe, locking eyes with her, letting her see the hurt, the betrayal, but also the strength that was rising inside me. Zoe, if you walk out that door with him, we're done. There's no coming back from this. You make that choice, and our marriage is over. She hesitated, the weight of my words sinking in. Gerald stepped between us, trying to regain control. Don't listen to him, Zoe, he said, his voice hard. He's bluffing. He'll take you back no matter what. But I wasn't bluffing. I had made my decision. I wasn't going to let them destroy me, not like this. You have until tomorrow morning to make your choice, I said, my voice cold and final. But know this. If you walk out that door, I won't be here when you come back. And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving them both standing there, stunned, as the reality of the situation sank in. I had made my stand, and now it was up to Zoe to decide what mattered more, her weekend with Gerald, or the life we had built together. I stormed out of the living room, my mind racing. I couldn't think straight. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to do something, anything, to stop this madness. I wasn't just going to stand there and let this smug prick take my wife away for a weekend of enlightenment, as if I were some insignificant obstacle to be brushed aside. I heard Gerald laugh from behind me, that arrogant, condescending tone ringing in my ears, and something inside me snapped. My blood boiled. The humiliation, the betrayal, the sheer audacity of this guy walking into my home and threatening me in front of Zoe. It was too much. I couldn't let him win. I wouldn't let him win. Without thinking, I turned back toward the living room, my fists clenched so tightly my knuckles were white. Gerald was still standing there, leaning against the wall with that cocky smirk plastered across his face, while Zoe shifted nervously beside him, looking between the two of us as if she were trapped in some sick game. "Richard," she started, her voice wavering, but I didn't let her finish. "No," I interrupted, my voice sharp and hard. "This isn't happening, Zoe. Not like this. Not with him." Gerald chuckled again, clearly amused by my outburst. "Come on, man," he said, stepping forward, his hands outstretched like he was trying to calm down a child. "You're taking this way too seriously. It's just a weekend. You'll see. She'll come back to you better than ever. Hell, she'll probably even thank me." The casualness with which he said it made me sick. I wanted to wipe that smug look off his face, to show him that I wasn't some pushover husband he could bully into submission. He didn't know who he was dealing with. I squared my shoulders, taking a deep breath, and met Gerald's gaze head on. "I have a proposal," I said slowly, carefully, my voice low and steady. Gerald raised an eyebrow, his smirk deepening. "Oh? What's that?" I took another step closer, my body tense with the barely contained rage boiling just beneath the surface. "We fight, you and me, right now. If I win, you leave Zoe alone. Forever." Gerald blinked, clearly taken aback for a split second, before he broke into a wide grin, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're serious? You want to fight me? Over this?" Zoe gasped, stepping between us. "Richard, no. This is insane." But I wasn't listening to her anymore. My eyes were locked on Gerald, waiting for his answer. I wasn't bluffing. I was dead serious, and I could tell from the look on his face that, for the first time, he realized it too. Gerald chuckled again, though this time there was a hint of something else in his voice, maybe uncertainty, maybe fear. "All right, tough guy," he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "Let's say I agree to this. What's in it for me if I win?" I took a deep breath, the tension thick between us. "If you win," I said, "then Zoe can go with you and I'll step aside. No more fights, no more threats. You get your weekend. Gerald's smile returned, wider than before, as if he had already won. You really think you can beat me? He asked, his tone dripping with condescension. I mean, look at you. It wasn't lost on me that Gerald was bigger, stronger, and in better shape than I was, but none of that mattered right now. This wasn't just a physical fight. It was about something much deeper, my pride, my dignity, everything I had built with Zoe over the past 6 years. And I wasn't about to let some asshole take that away from me without a fight. I'm not fighting for her, I said, my voice low and controlled. I'm fighting for my self-respect. That must have struck a nerve, because Gerald's smile faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing. He straightened up, stepping closer until he was inches away from me. I could smell the cologne he wore, sharp and expensive, and it only fueled my anger. Fine, he said finally, his voice cold and hard. Let's do this. Zoe stood frozen between us, her eyes wide with panic. You guys, please, this is crazy, you can't— Stay out of it, Zoe, I said, my voice harsher than I intended. She flinched, but I couldn't afford to comfort her right now. This was between me and Gerald. This was the only way to end it. We laid down the rules quickly. No weapons, no cheap shots, no calling the cops when it was over. The fight would end when one of us hit the ground, flat on his back. Simple enough. Gerald stretched his neck, rolling his shoulders, his smirk firmly back in place. He was confident, too confident, and that worked in my favor. He didn't see me as a threat, and that was exactly what I needed. We moved outside, into the backyard. The night was cool, the air thick with tension as we squared off under the dim light from the kitchen window. The garden I'd worked so hard to maintain seemed like a strange backdrop to what was about to happen, but none of that mattered anymore. I could see Gerald sizing me up, assessing me like he was already plotting out how to knock me down. He threw a couple of quick jabs into the air, like a boxer warming up for a fight, his muscles rippling beneath his designer shirt. You sure about this, Richard? Gerald called out, his voice teasing, taunting. You're not exactly built for this kind of thing. I didn't respond. My heart was pounding, my blood boiling, but my mind was clear. I had to play this smart. Gerald had the size, but I had something he didn't. Determination. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for the life Zoe and I had built, for the love that had brought us together, even if it felt like that love was slipping away. Gerald came at me fast, throwing a wild punch aimed at my face, but I ducked just in time, feeling the rush of air as his fist sailed past my ear. I countered with a quick jab to his ribs, but it barely fazed him. He was solid, and I knew this wasn't going to be easy. Gerald laughed, clearly enjoying himself. Come on, man, is that all you've got? He swung again, this time connecting with my shoulder, sending me stumbling backward. The pain shot through me, but I gritted my teeth, refusing to back down. I steadied myself, planting my feet firmly in the dirt. We circled each other for a few moments, neither of us saying a word, just the sound of our breathing filling the tense silence. I knew I couldn't beat him with brute strength. I'd have to outsmart him. I just needed one good opening. Gerald charged at me again, this time aiming for my gut. I sidestepped at the last second, catching him off guard, as I brought my elbow down hard on the back of his neck. He grunted, stumbling forward, but quickly regained his balance. You're a slippery little bastard, aren't you? He growled, wiping a smear of dirt from his chin. I didn't answer. I was too focused, too determined. I needed to end this, and fast. He lunged at me, fists flying, and this time he clipped me hard on the jaw. I saw stars for a moment, my vision swimming as I staggered back, but I kept my footing, refusing to go down. I could hear Zoe screaming in the background, begging us to stop, but her voice was distant, like it was coming from underwater. Gerald pressed his advantage, coming at me with another flurry of punches, but I ducked and weaved, avoiding most of them. I felt one glance off my side, sending a jolt of pain through my ribs, but I didn't let it slow me down. Then finally, I saw my opening. Gerald was overextending himself, getting too cocky, too eager to end it. He threw a wild haymaker, leaving his midsection wide open. Without hesitating, I drove my fist into his stomach with everything I had. Gerald gasped, the air rushing out of him as he doubled over. I didn't give him a chance to recover. I grabbed him by the back of the neck, yanking him forward and slamming my knee into his chest. The impact sent him stumbling backward, his arms flailing as he tried to regain his balance. But it was too late. His foot caught on a garden stone and he fell hard, crashing onto his back with a loud thud. It was over. Gerald lay there groaning, clutching his side as the reality of what had just happened sank in. I stood over him, breathing heavily, my fists still clenched, but I knew I had won. "No more," I growled, my voice barely above a whisper. "You leave her alone. You stay the fuck away from us." Gerald groaned, glaring up at me through the pain, but he didn't say a word. He knew he'd lost. Zoe rushed forward, tears streaming down her face, but I couldn't look at her. I couldn't face the woman who had almost thrown everything away for this man. "Get him out of here," I said coldly, turning my back on them both. "And don't come back." As I stood over Gerald, watching him struggle to catch his breath, the adrenaline that had fueled me throughout the fight began to fade. My hands still trembled from the rush of it all, but instead of the satisfaction I thought I'd feel, there was only emptiness. I'd won, but it didn't matter. There was no joy in this victory, just a deep, gnawing sense of betrayal that settled in the pit of my stomach. Gerald groaned, rolling onto his side, his face twisted in pain. Zoe knelt beside him, her eyes wide and wet with tears, but I couldn't bring myself to care. The sight of her kneeling there, comforting the man she had brought into our home, only deepened the ache inside me. How had we gotten here? How had the woman I loved, who I had promised to spend the rest of my life with, chosen this? Chosen him? I stared at Zoe, my heart pounding, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say? How do you explain to someone that the love you once had is dead, killed by their actions, by the lies and betrayal? The silence between us was suffocating. "Richard," Zoe started, her voice shaky, "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just thought this would help us. I thought—" I cut her off, my voice cold and hollow. "Help us?" The words burned my throat as they came out. "You thought fucking another man for a weekend would help us?" Zoe flinched at my harsh tone, her tears spilling over, but I didn't feel any sympathy. I couldn't, not anymore. "I don't know what I was thinking," she sobbed, looking between me and Gerald, who was still writhing in the dirt. "I made a mistake, Richard, but I love you. I do love you. Please don't let this end us." I laughed, the sound bitter and ugly in the night air. "End us? Zoe, it was already over the moment you brought him here, the moment you decided that whatever we had wasn't enough for you." I watched her face crumble at my words, the reality of what she'd done finally sinking in. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and no amount of pleading or promises could fix it. I turned and headed for the house, my steps heavy, my mind numb. I didn't need to hear any more of her excuses. I didn't want to listen to her beg for forgiveness or try to explain away the unforgivable. What was left to save? The house felt cold when I stepped inside, a strange stillness filling the space that had once felt like home. Now, it was just a reminder of everything we'd lost, everything I'd lost. The dinner I'd so carefully prepared sat untouched on the table, the candles long since burned out. The roses I'd bought, bright, vibrant, a symbol of love, were already starting to wilt, their petals beginning to curl at the edges. Without thinking, I grabbed a suitcase from the closet and headed for the bedroom. I needed to get her out of here. I couldn't stand the thought of her. Staying in this house, sleeping in the same bed we'd shared for years, Not after everything that had happened. I yanked open the drawers, grabbing her clothes and stuffing them into the suitcase. Shirts, pants, dresses, it didn't matter. I didn't care what I packed or how it looked. I just needed her gone. The sound of the zipper as I closed the suitcase felt final, like the slamming of a door on the life we'd built together. As I made my way back downstairs, suitcase in hand, Zoe was standing in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. Gerald was gone, probably slinking away into the night, nursing his bruised ego and broken body. But I didn't care about him. He was nothing. It was Zoe who had broken my heart. "Richard, please," she cried, stepping toward me, her voice desperate. "Don't do this. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes, I swear." I held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. "There's nothing left to fix, Zoe." Her face crumpled, her sobs growing louder, but I didn't waver. I couldn't. She had destroyed any trust we had, any hope of rebuilding what we'd once had. I'd loved her. God, I'd loved her so much. But that love had turned to ash the moment she chose Gerald over me, the moment she decided that I wasn't enough. "You made your choice," I said, my voice steady, though my heart felt like it was breaking all over again. "You chose him, and now I'm choosing to walk away." She shook her head frantically, reaching out for me, but I stepped back, holding the suitcase out toward her. "Go, Zoe. Take your things and leave. I don't want to see you here anymore." Zoe stared at the suitcase, her eyes wide with disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend what was happening. "You can't mean this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I do." My voice was cold, detached, the words barely feeling like my own. But they were true. I couldn't live like this, with her betrayal hanging over us, poisoning everything we'd built. She hesitated, then slowly took the suitcase from my hand, her fingers trembling. "This can't be the end, Richard," she pleaded. "We've been through so much. Don't let it end like this." I looked at her, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time in months. She was still the woman I had fallen in love with, the woman I had married. But she wasn't my Zoe anymore, not after what she'd done. "It's already over," I said quietly, turning away from her. I couldn't bear to look at her anymore, to see the pain in her eyes that mirrored the pain in my chest. "Go." For a moment, she stood there, frozen in place, as if waiting for me to change my mind. But I didn't. I couldn't. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned and walked out the door, the sound of her sobs fading into the night as she disappeared from view. The door closed with a final deafening thud, and I stood there, alone in the silence of the house that no longer felt like home. The weight of what had just happened settled heavily on my shoulders, and I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. I had won the fight. I had stopped Gerald, but I had lost Zoe, lost the life we'd built together, the future we had planned. All of it was gone, shattered by her betrayal. I felt nothing but emptiness. It had been months since that night, the night I threw Zoe out of my life, along with all the shattered pieces of what we once had. The days after the fight, after I had packed her things and watched her leave, had been a blur of anger and heartbreak. But over time, the raw pain that had consumed me started to dull, settling into something more manageable, more distant. Life had a strange way of moving forward, even when you thought it couldn't, even when you thought you couldn't. The house had felt impossibly quiet at first, every room echoing with memories of Zoe. But eventually, the silence became peaceful, a relief from the constant tension that had lingered between us during those final months. I had stopped trying to fill the emptiness she left behind, choosing instead to focus on myself, on healing. I'd thrown myself into work, taking every flight I could, staying in the air for as long as possible. It was easier up there, above the clouds, where everything felt small and insignificant compared to the vastness of the sky. But the real change came when Clara moved in. Clara had been working for me part-time, helping to clean the house, keep things in order. She was quiet, efficient, and had a calm presence that made it easier to deal with the aftermath of everything. After Zoe left, she offered to take on more hours, sensing that I wasn't ready to be alone in the house. I accepted, not realizing then how much I would come to depend on her. At first, Clara kept to herself, doing her work without saying much. She was kind, though, always thoughtful in the little things, leaving fresh flowers in the living room, making sure the kitchen was stocked with my favorite coffee, folding the laundry just the way I liked. But over time, something shifted between us. Slowly, quietly, we began to talk more, share more. It started with simple conversations about her life, her background, her family. Then, one day, she asked me how I was doing, really doing. No one had asked me that in months. I opened up to her in a way I hadn't expected. I told her about the pain, about the betrayal, about the anger that still simmered deep inside me. And Clara listened, truly listened, without judgment, without interruption. She didn't offer empty words of comfort or try to tell me everything would be okay. She just let me talk, let me be honest about what I was feeling. And for the first time since Zoe had left, I felt like I wasn't drowning anymore. As the weeks went on, our conversations became longer, more personal. I found myself looking forward to her presence, to the sound of her voice, the warmth of her smile. Clara had this quiet strength about her, this unwavering calm that made everything seem less chaotic, less overwhelming. And as much as I tried to ignore it, as much as I told myself it was too soon, I couldn't deny that something was growing between us. It wasn't long before that something turned into more. I don't know exactly when it happened, when the lines blurred between employer and employee, between casual conversation and something deeper. But one evening, as I walked her to the door after she finished her shift, she turned to face me, her eyes soft, searching. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty in her expression, but then she leaned in, closing the distance between us, and pressed her lips to mine. It was soft, tentative, nothing like the desperate, passionate kisses Zoe and I had shared during the good times. But in that moment, it was everything I needed. Clara was a breath of fresh air, something new, something gentle, something real. From that point on, things between us changed. Clara began staying later, sometimes not leaving at all. She filled the spaces in my life that had once been consumed by Zoe, not with loud declarations of love, but with small, meaningful gestures that reminded me what it was like to be cared for without conditions. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't broken. I was healing. That's why, when Zoe showed up on my doorstep, months after I had thrown her out, I felt nothing but indifference. It was a rainy afternoon when I heard the knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Clara was out running errands, and I had been enjoying the quiet, flipping through the pages of a book I'd been meaning to read for weeks. The knock came again, more insistent this time, and with a sigh I set the book down and made my way to the door. When I opened it, I froze. There she was, Zoe, soaked from the rain, her hair clinging to her face, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She looked like a ghost, a shadow of the woman I had once loved. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there staring at each other, the sound of the rain filling the silence between us. "Richard," she whispered, her voice shaky. I need to talk to you." I didn't move. I didn't invite her in. I didn't even feel the familiar pang of pain that used to hit me whenever I thought about her. Instead, I felt detached, like she was just another stranger at my door, someone I used to know. "What do you want, Zoe?" I asked, my voice calm, almost indifferent. She wiped at her eyes, looking down at the ground as if she couldn't bear to meet my gaze. I made a mistake," she said softly. A huge mistake. I crossed my arms over my chest, waiting for her to continue. I shouldn't have done what I did, she went on, her voice cracking. I know I hurt you. I know I betrayed you, and I regret it. Every day. I can't stop thinking about what I lost, about how I threw away the best thing in my life. And I want to come back. I want to fix things. I sighed, leaning against the doorframe. It's too late, Zoe. She flinched, her eyes filling with fresh tears. Richard, please. I know I messed up. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I still love you. I've always loved you. Loved me? I scoffed. You loved me when you walked out of this house to spend the weekend with Gerald? You loved me when you stood there, telling me you needed him more than me? Her sobs grew louder, and she reached out, her hand trembling. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I was confused. No, I said sharply, cutting her off. You made a choice, and that choice destroyed us. Zoe shook her head frantically, stepping forward. Richard, I'll do anything to make this right. I miss you. I miss us. Please, just give me another chance. But I didn't miss her. I didn't miss us. That part of my life was over. I had spent months grieving, mourning the loss of the marriage I thought we had. But I had moved on. And now, standing, here in front of her, I realized that I didn't feel anything for her anymore. No anger, no pain, just nothing. I can't do that, Zoe, I said quietly. Her face crumpled, and she let out a broken sob, sinking to her knees. Please, Richard, I'll do anything. Just, please don't let it end like this. I sighed, looking down at her. It's already over, Zoe. It ended the night you walked out of this house. I've moved on. I've let you go. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. What do you mean, moved on? Is there someone else? I hesitated for a moment before answering. Yes, Clara. The name hit her like a slap to the face, and I watched as the realization washed over her. Zoe's lips trembled, and she shook her head slowly. Clara, the maid? Richard, she's just... Don't, I warned, my voice cold. Clara is more than you ever were. Zoe's sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands, rocking back and forth on the porch. But I didn't move. I didn't reach out to comfort her. There was no point. I wasn't the man she could manipulate anymore. That part of my life was over. After a few minutes, I stepped back into the house, leaving Zoe sobbing in the rain. I closed the door softly behind me, shutting out the sound of her cries, shutting out the past that had haunted me for so long. Clara would be home soon, and for the first time in months, I felt free.